Hail and welcome. Paul here, once again. Now, in my last lecture, we talked about Canute the Great, and how, for a brief time, he united England and Scandinavia into a powerful North Sea empire. I also mentioned at the end how he founded a very powerful military order called the Housecarls. We talked about how he was married to the widow of Ethelred the Unready, Emma of Normandy, who, after Canute's death, would be sent into exile in Flanders by Canute's illegitimate son, Svein. But in time, Emma's son to Ethelred the Unready, Edward, would return to England to reclaim Anglo-Saxon rule. Now, Edward was known throughout history as Hereward the Confessor, and this is said to be because he was seen as a very saintly and pious figure, and supposedly he had the power to heal the sick. I also mentioned how Canute set up different earls in the former 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the earl ruling in Wessex, where Canute's throne was named Godwin. Not only was he an important sidekick to Canute, but really the power of England rested on Godwin's shoulders. He really was the driving force behind all of Canute's power. Now, after Canute's death, the crown of England would be taken by his son, Harold Harefoot. Supposedly, one of Ethelred's sons to Emma of Normandy, named Alfred, yes, another Alfred, tried to take the throne for a while, and Godwin seized him and killed him. Then, after Harold Harefoot died, Godwin supported and helped put Canute's other son, Harthacnut, also born to Emma of Normandy, on the throne. After Harthacnut died, Godwin backed Edward the Confessor's crowning. So we can pretty much consider Godwin not just a powerful earl, but the ultimate kingmaker. Now, before taking the crown of England, Edward the Confessor spent much of his life in Normandy. And the best way for me to explain who the Normans are is to go into detail. So I'm going to take a moment here to digress from 11th century England and talk about 9th and 10th century France. So, for as long as the Vikings had been attacking England, they had also been attacking France. They had been attacking in full force pretty much since after the death of Charlemagne at the beginning of the 9th century, and the attacks seemed to get worse and worse as the years went on. And in 885, the Vikings led a second major siege on Paris, the first one being in 845. This siege was led by a Viking warlord named Rollo. Now, not a lot is known about Rollo's origins. Some believe he was Norwegian, some believe he was Danish, we are not sure. It is also thought that he fought in England with the Great Heathen Army. We are not sure about that either. But what we do know is that he attacked Paris with a considerably large host between the years 885 and 886. And Rollo would continue to lead Viking raids in France for the next 2 decades, give or take. He led a major attack on Chartres in the year 911, and at the time, the King of France was named Charles the Simple, and as the name implies, he was kind of an idiot. He was basically the French version of Ethelred the Unready. Well, long story short, Rollo and Charles would agree on a peace treaty where Charles would grant Rollo land in the north of France, the lands formerly known as Neustrasia. These lands would become known as Normandy, Northman's land. Rollo would also be baptized and given the Christian name Robert, but it is also thought that this could have been to keep up appearances. Going forward, Normandy would become one of the most powerful duchies in all of Europe, a duchy being a region in a kingdom ruled by a duke. And during the reign of Rollo's son, William Longsword, the inhabitants of Normandy became a distinct culture of their own, a hybrid of French and Scandinavian. This is very similar to what happened in England in the Danelaw. The main difference being that the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons are already very similar to each other. The only real thing that many Danes changed when they settled in England was their religion, though a few kept to the old ways. They would have had similar language, clothing, and the main thing that the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons had in common was their warfare. Both groups fought with heavy infantry units, doing shield wall combat. They fought each other using the same tactics, and other groups they fought, like the Scots and the Britons, would have fought the same way. On the continent, however, you started seeing a new kind of fighting develop, fighting with heavy cavalry units. This really started in the late 8th and early 9th centuries during Charlemagne, and these equestrian warriors would come to be known as knights. Their ranking and relationship to their king was very similar to that of a thane in Anglo-Saxon England, but fighting on horseback was really the defining feature that makes a knight a knight. The Anglo-Saxons did not fight on horseback. This was completely foreign to them. They valued horses quite a bit. Horses were a symbol of status and wealth. Therefore, the idea of risking your animal's life, your animal that is your mode of transportation first and foremost, was just bizarre to them. To the Anglo-Saxons, you ride your horse to the battlefield, then dismount and form a shield wall. Now, I guess if you want to think of it in a modern context, say you were going to fight somebody nowadays. Would you fight fist to fist, or would you smash your cars into each other? Well, neither of you want to be without your car, so you go fist to fist. That was the Anglo-Saxons' logic. However, the French and Germans were used to fighting against the Muslim Saracens from Spain and the Magyars from Hungary, who would both fight on horseback, lightly equipped with archers, riding fast. But the Franks would fight with heavy cavalry, with lances, spears, and longswords. So, while Saracen and Magyar cavalry can be compared to a swarm of hornets, Frankish cavalry was more like a freight train. The Normans were bringing cavalry fighting to a whole new level, mixing it with the organization of Viking warfare. They were also breeding very powerful war horses that were larger and fiercer than anything the English had ever seen before. And see them they would, which I will get to soon. Alright, now back to England in the 11th century. Ethelred the Unready really created the first connection between England and Normandy by marrying Emma. So their children would be half Anglo-Saxon and half Norman. After Emma and her son were exiled to the continent, Edward spent a good bit of time in Normandy before returning to England to take the throne. And supposedly the Normans had a profound influence on him too. One of the main areas where we see this is in the construction of the Westminster Abbey, England's first Norman Romanesque church, and its first piece of Norman architecture in general. So Edward came to the throne in 1042 and was invited out of exile by Canut's son, King Harthacnut, because he supposedly did not have any heirs, and he chose Edward to be his successor. The other nobles in Harthacnut's court approved of Edward, most notably that Earl of Wessex I was talking about previously, Godwin. And he was supposedly a very good and efficient king. He was bringing to England the efficiency of the governing style on the continent. He also had a strong influence over church matters, which brings me to an important occurrence. In 1050, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Eadsig, died and was succeeded by a monk named Ethelred. Now, Edward did not approve of Ethelred, and he tried to give the archbishopric to a Norman abbot named Robert of Jumier, which Earl Godwin was not pleased about, as he was a relative of Ethelred. And there was something Robert supposedly did that would create trouble for Godwin's successor, that he told the Duke of Normandy, William the Bastard, that Edward chose him as his successor since he did not have any heirs. Now, around this time, Godwin led a rebellion against Edward, and Edward crushed the rebellion with the help of the Earls of Northumbria and Mercia. And also, on a complete side note, the Earl of Mercia was named Leofric, the husband of Lady Godiva, who has her own interesting legendary story that you might know. If not, I'll let you look into it on your own. Eventually, Godwin would regain his grip over Wessex, but the rebellion had turned into a full-on civil war. And it is said that Edward the Confessor was attempting to Normanize England and reduce the influence of the House of Godwin. Godwin held strong for a short time. However, he would soon fall dead in the year 1053, and his son, Harold Godwin's son, would become the next earl. In 1055, Harold's brother, Tostig, would become Earl of Northumbria, but he was not very well liked there, and was driven out by the people 10 years later, in 1065. It is also thought that in the previous year, Harold traveled to Normandy to reassure Duke William that he would be crowned King of England after Edward's death. We aren't 100% sure about this. It could be true, could not be, but if it were true, Harold didn't exactly uphold that oath, and he took the crown of England in the January of 1066. And as you can imagine, this made Duke William very upset. But it wasn't just him who was upset. The King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, felt like he had a claim to the English throne based on an agreement he made with Harthacnut. And yes, there are two Harolds now. The English king, Harold Godwinson, and the Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada. So for this part, I will refer to them by their last names. Well, Hardrada landed in Northumbria, being aided by Godwinson's exiled brother, Tostig. Now, this was right around the time that Godwinson was anticipating an invasion from William in the south. He then found himself with no choice but to lead his troops north to deal with this Viking threat, which is seen as one of history's most interesting twists of fate. Well, Godwinson met with the Norwegians in York, and his Saxon army would be defeated at the Battle of Fulford, and the Norsemen would occupy that city for 5 days. Godwinson struck back and crushed Hardrada's Vikings at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The English took the Vikings by surprise and completely ambushed them. Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and their army was destroyed. And not only that, but this was also seen as the last great battle between the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. And 1066 is often considered to be the end of the Viking Age, at least in England. This was considered a huge success for Godwinson, but of course we have one major problem here. The whole south coast of England was left idle, and William had arrived with his Norman forces, as well as mercenaries from Flanders, Brittany, and other provinces in the Kingdom of France. They landed in Pevensey in the September of that year and began their occupation of that area. When Harold Godwinson returned to face him, his army was considerably weakened after their victory against the Vikings and from the long travel. Not only that, but as I stated before, the Normans were bringing a style of warfare to the battlefield that was foreign to the Anglo-Saxons: cavalry fighting. And so it was that the Saxons and Normans met for a decisive battle on October 14th, 1066, at a place called Hastings. The battle lasted all day, and at first, the Saxon shield wall, which was led by Harold's housecarls, held firm, and they were successfully pushing the mounted knights back. However, William then came up with a strategy to bluff Harold, pretending to retreat, but then turning on the pursuing Saxons while their guard was down. It turned out that Harold's Saxon infantry was no match for William's mounted knights. Harold Godwinson was killed in this battle, and it is thought that the cause of his death was an arrow in the eye. We see this in the Bayeux Tapestry, an embroidered cloth depicting the battle that measures 230 feet long and 20 feet high. Now, despite the name, this tapestry was made in England, not in Bayeux, which is in France. It's called that because it was commissioned by the Bishop of Bayeux, Odo, who was William's half-brother. And it was basically a big piece of pro-Norman propaganda, really. You can still see the tapestry in the Bayeux Museum. The whole piece of art goes through the events that took place in the battle, from the beginning of the day to the end. After the battle, William the Bastard, who would become more famously known throughout history as William the Conqueror, was crowned as King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. Many of the English nobles submitted to William, but he also gave England a major Norman-French makeover. For starters, he brought in new royal titles like Duke, Baron, Count. This change would come gradually throughout the next decade, and also housecarls and thanes would be replaced by knights. He also brought a change in architecture. Rather than the system of burhs that we saw previously, we now, for the first time, see the construction of castles. Rather than having fortified towns with a king's palace or great hall within the fortifications, you would have the castle built on a raised area of ground called a moat, and its rampart would be surrounding a courtyard or a bailey, hence the name Moat and Bailey. Also with a keep, where the king and all his nobles would dwell. William built many castles all across England, all within a day's travel of each other. In doing this, William also brought another key element that would help shape the High and Late Middle Ages: feudalism. In feudalism, The king owned all the land and would distribute the land amongst his nobles, and the land would be worked by a peasant class, serfs. There would be many rebellions against the Normans by the Anglo-Saxons in the following years, most notably by a semi-legendary figure named Hereward the Wake. But these powerful structures that were new to England at the time would prove the Normans to be the victors. A lot of these rebellions were coming from Northumbria, which William put down in the year 1070 in a very tumultuous period called the Harrying of the North, a completely brutal, forced subjugation on the folk of northern England. He soon eradicated the remaining nobles throughout all of England and replaced them with Normans. According to the Domesday Book, a manuscript that William had created to survey England's wealth, about 75% of the Anglo-Saxon population was wiped out. England officially belonged to the Normans now, no longer to the Anglo-Saxons. Throughout the High Middle Ages, Old English would only be spoken by the peasants and also of lower-ranking warriors, while Norman French would be the language of the nobility. This would, throughout the years, create much tension between England and France, because now the Duke of Normandy, who is supposed to be a subject to the French king, is now his equal, a king in his own right of a more powerful kingdom. Despite all of this, the importance of what the Anglo-Saxons did cannot be denied. They laid the groundwork for this power that William would inherit. Plus, the land would not be changed to be called Norman land or Norm land. It would continue to be called England, the land of the Angles, and we still speak English, even if it has evolved and taken on a French and Latin influence. And despite the power of William and his Norman French takeover, he could not erase the lasting impact that the Anglo-Saxons had on the island of Britain. Looking back in retrospect, first, in the 5th century, they crossed the North Sea from Germany. They overcame the Welsh, and they took hold of the island of Britain, and began to carve out the land that would be known as England. In the 6th century, they converted to Christianity, and their kingdoms truly began to rise to power, peaking throughout the 7th and 8th centuries. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, they withstood Viking attacks, eventually forcing the invaders into diplomacy, and would intermingle and coexist with these foreigners. And a few important monarchs put into theory, eventually into practice, that these divided kingdoms would all be united into one kingdom. And then, in the beginning of the 11th century, one such Scandinavian invader would become king of the Anglo-Saxon peoples, as well as his own, bringing England to a power it had never seen before, leading to a group of French knights descended from Vikings to take over and usher in a new era of English medieval history. But the legacy of what the Anglo-Saxons did will live on throughout history and will not be forgotten. Well, that is all for my lectures on Dark Age Britain. I hope you all enjoyed them. I will return in the fall to teach the history of the Frankish Empire, France and Germany. Now, in a few of my lectures, I promoted some books, and in this one, I am going to promote a band, a heavy metal band. They are called Forefather, They are from England. Surrey, which is in the southeast near Sussex and Kent. Their style is kind of like a mix between black metal and power metal, and they are 100% based on Anglo-Saxon history. They are a studio band only, so they don't play live, and they consist of two brothers who go by the names of Wulfstan and Athelstan. They also do dueling vocals. One does harsh vocals and the other does clean. A lot of people mislabel them as Viking metal, but they hate being called that because they are not Vikings. They are Saxons. They have songs about killing Vikings. What's really funny is that they are definitely a pagan band. They sing about Woden and the Sisters of Weird, but then they'll also go sing about Christian kings like Alfred and Athelstan. It's an English thing. Well, I'm going to leave you with this song because I think a song is a good thing to end these lectures on. Now, most of their songs are heavy and fast, but the song I'm going to share with you is an acoustic ballad, and it's about the Battle of Hastings. It is called When Our England Died. Enjoy, and was through all.
Battle they strove.